Right, let's do a visual introduction to the anatomy of the respiratory system from nose to the alveoli in the lungs, and we'll consider the structures as we go through. We'll look at the shape, we'll look at the branching of the tree, we'll look at the lungs and the parts of the lungs, and we'll consider how do we fill the lungs with air and that sort of thing, you know, anatomy stuff, all right? I'll grab some more models in a minute, but first let's consider what it is that the respiratory system needs. Well, its job, of course, is to take oxygen in from the air and push CO2 out into the air from the body. So we're going to need lots of surface area, massive amounts of surface area. That's often a theme within the body. We're going to need lots of blood to go with that surface area. We're going to need very thin walls between the blood and the gas. Oh, and we're going to need some fluid, so the gas will dissolve into the fluid so that we can have diffusion of the gases across that thin membrane. We're going to need to protect the airway. We're going to need to keep it humidified for that gas. And what we're aiming for here is so that the partial pressures of oxygen and CO2 are such that O2 and CO2 will move in and out of the body across that membrane, in and out of the air. Oh yes, and of course we're going to need to pull that air in and push that air out enough so that we exchange those gases. Wow, there's quite a lot going on here. But this means that the airway is an external surface inside us, and when we look at the gastrointestinal tract, which we pass food along and we absorb nutrients from, that's the same. That's also an external surface inside us. So the respiratory system is managing an external surface with air from the outside within it, but keeping it separate from the body itself, which is an interesting idea. And the fun thing here is that in the embryo, the gastrointestinal tract forms first as a simple tube, a tube of muscle and what have you, and then the respiratory tract grows out of the gastrointestinal tract. It buds from that. It's a tube that forms from a tube, which probably gives us some clues to our own evolution, right? Right, let's look at some of these structures. Okay, so the start of the respiratory system is the nose, is the nasal cavity. That's where we draw air in, and somehow that air has to get down to the lungs in the chest. We can also use the mouth, but we'll come to that in a moment. Right, let me grab an actual nose. So here we have half a head, and the nose, of course, we have this cartilaginous sticky outy bit, which is great when it's raining because it means you don't get rain in your airway, right? And that's the nasal cavity there. There is a septum in the midlines. There's a divider between the left and right sides, which means that actually the nasal cavity are two fairly narrow spaces that we draw air into. And the bone here has some curly shapes, the conchae. And these conchae are adding surface area already. So they're adding surface area to the nasal cavity, and they're covered in a mucous membrane, which is really well vascularized. There are lots of blood vessels in here, which is why nosebleeds are sometimes a problem, because when you burst the blood vessels here, a lot of blood comes out. But that is there so that when we breathe in through our nose, the air is warmed towards body temperature and is humidified, because remember I said that for gaseous exchange to occur in the lungs, that needs to be moist. So we want to keep that moisture inside us. We don't want to dry out too much. And we also have these around the nasal cavity. These are paranasal sinuses. So the bones around the nasal cavity have got spaces in them, which might be to lighten the face. They might be to change the vocal qualities of the voice. They might be there to help humidify and warm the air that we breathe in and out. They're probably for all of those reasons. But these paranasal sinuses are connected to the nasal cavity, and they are also lined with the mucous membrane, and they do aid in warming and humidifying that air as we breathe it in. And of course we can get infections in this area. So if an infection, virus or bacteria, passes into those paranasal sinuses, that can cause pain in the face. if we get an infection in the nasal cavity, the swelling of the tissues here narrows that already narrow space. We get a blocked nose, right? Which changes the quality of the voice, right? Now, if you're passing air through this nasal cavity, if you wanted to detect molecules in that air, this would be a great place to put sensors that might detect those molecules. Oh, and the brain could make sense of detecting those molecules by creating smells and things like that, right? So this is where we find the olfactory epithelium. This is where we do olfaction. This is where we do smell. So that's the nasal cavity, a left one and a right one. And the air then passes back to this space posteriorly. This is the pharynx here, and it connects to the oral cavity. So yes, we can breathe in through our mouths when we need to. So when you need more air, when you're exercising, when you're running, when you're jogging, when you're running up a flight of stairs or whatever, you can open your mouth and pull more air in and push more air out through your mouth. But most of the time, we tend to breathe through the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity is considered the start of the respiratory tract. The oral cavity is considered the start of the digestive tract, but they overlap here. And as we descend down here, there's the airway. It's held open by cartilage. And this is the esophagus here, the food tube, which isn't always open. It's normally closed. It's a muscular tube. It opens when we pass food down it. So there is a risk here, because we have this overlapping of airway and foodway, that food or water might pass into the airway, which would be bad. And we'll see that there are some protective mechanisms against that. This here then, this is the larynx. Now the larynx is a series of cartilage structures, which is great because we need this to be open all the time, don't we? We don't want it to collapse. We want to easily draw air through here. So we have a bunch of cartilaginous structures making a tube, and we take advantage of that by putting membranes in there. If we pull those membranes close together and then we force air over those membranes, we can produce sound, and then we use other structures to change the quality of that sound, and we can talk and grunt and things like that, right? Now, this is also the larynx. So the pharynx is back here, and the air goes down there, the larynx. This is the prominent thyroid cartilage that you can palpate here. And it's continuous with the trachea. But this is a significant part of the airway then. And in there, we'll see the vocal cords. There's the trachea, there are the vocal cords, and this cartilage here is the epiglottis. This all moves up and down when we swallow, and the epiglottis flaps over the airway to try to encourage food to go around it and down the esophagus. Works pretty well. But the whole larynx can close together, and the vocal cords can close together to prevent food and water going down the airway when we swallow. So the larynx, as well as producing speech, has a number of protective mechanisms in there to protect the airway. And then this is the thyroid cartilage, this is the cricoid cartilage, then the trachea begins. So we talk about an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. For example, we talk about upper respiratory tract infections when we have a blocked nose and a bit of a sore throat. So the upper respiratory tract is from the nose to the upper larynx. And then the lower respiratory tract is from the lower larynx through the airway all the way to the alveoli in the lungs. Right, here we go then. So there's the trachea in there. We'll do a little bit of dissection. I'm going to take the anterior parts of the lungs out. I'm going to take the heart out to see how the heart is very anterior. See how these great vessels here cover over the airway, the trachea. So the trachea descends down into the thorax, and it divides here into two main bronchi. The point at which it divides, this is a bifurcation of the airway, split into two. And this gets called the carina. So the trachea becomes the left main bronchus and the right main bronchus, because we have a left lung and a right lung, so the airway is reflecting that. There are some other major structures nearby. Here's the esophagus, and that's posterior to the airway. remember the airway has grown from the esophagus, from the gastrointestinal tract. And this great big blood vessel over here, that's the aorta. So the left and right main bronchi continue into the lungs, and as soon as they go into the lungs, they branch. And the right main bronchus is a little bit steeper than the left main bronchus. Not sure this model represents that. So in most people, if an object is inhaled accidentally into the airway, it's most likely to fall into the right main bronchus because it's a little bit steeper. But the lobes of the lungs are a little bit different on either side. So the left lung and the right lung are slightly different sizes because look, the heart pushes over to the left side of the chest. So there's a little bit less space for the left lung. And whether as a result of that or whether this is just basic programming, the left lung has 2 lobes and the right lung has 3 lobes. And the airway reflects that. So the main bronchus becomes 2 lobar bronchi, and each lobar bronchus goes to each of the lobes. There's a superior lobe and a lower lobe, which we'll look at in a moment. And then after the lobar bronchus, that divides again into segmental bronchi. The lung has multiple segments. Each segment has its own airway and its own blood supply. So we could also call these the primary bronchus, main, secondary bronchus, lobar, tertiary bronchus, segmental, first, second, third, right? And that branching pattern then continues as smaller and smaller bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and at the microscopic structure, the bronchiole then has alveoli attached to that. And the alveolus is a space where gaseous exchange occurs with very, very thin walls and lots of blood. Okay, so what about the blood then? Well, the blood vessels supplying blood to the lungs are larger than you would normally expect for an organ of that size. And that's because, of course, the lungs are doing work upon the blood. The pulmonary trunk takes blood from the right side of the heart and splits into left and right pulmonary arteries. They're blue because this is indicating that this is poorly oxygenated blood. That blood goes to each lung, and you can see the branching pattern starts as soon as the artery enters the lung. And again, these are branching to the lobes and the segments. They become tiny capillary beds surrounding those alveoli, massive surface area, massive blood supply, gaseous exchange occurs, and then the blood comes back as the pulmonary veins, now they're painted red to indicate that this is well oxygenated blood because the hemoglobin have grabbed hold of that oxygen. And the pulmonary veins are draining back to the left atrium of the heart, which will then send blood to the left ventricle and then out through the aorta and off around the body. Before we move on to the structure of the lungs themselves, one more note about the airway that's really important. So the airway is protected from particles in the air and stuff we breathe in. There are tonsils that protect us from bacteria and viruses that get in there. There are hairs in our nose that trap particles. There's lots of mucus, snot in the nasal cavity. Now, in the lower respiratory tract, so once we get past the larynx and we continue to descend, the epithelium, that is the sheet of cells lining the internal surface of the airway, it changes. It becomes what we call a respiratory epithelium. It becomes a pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium. What that means is it's a thin layer of cells, but the ciliated bit means that there are hair-like processes sticking out of the cells that can be moved by the cell. There are also goblet cells in here, and goblet cells make mucus. So the mucus is helping keeping the airway moist, keeping the moisture in there to aid gaseous exchange, right? But the moisture also traps particles. The way in which air flows through here, if particles get past your nose hair and the snot in your nose and gets into the airway, the mucus will hopefully trap those particles, and the cilia will lift that mucus back up the airway. This is the mucociliary escalator. And the mucus, once it gets back up to superior to the larynx, well, you might swallow that mucus or cough it up or spit it out or whatever. And that's an important method of keeping the airway clean and protecting the airway from particles, because it's very sensitive to that sort of thing, right? So the mucociliary escalator. Okay then, the lungs themselves. So when we look at the anterior chest, the lung doesn't look very big. It doesn't look like it's taking up a lot of space. And that's mostly because, well, the heart is anterior and it is taking up a lot of space. The lungs will take up all the space available to them when they're growing. So all these things grow together, right? So they all share the space available to them. The lung is very much like a sponge. It's mostly air, because that's its job, right? It's gaseous exchange. Lots and lots of air spaces with alveolar cells making the walls of the alveoli and the tubes we've talked about, and then capillary beds forming around those alveoli. So it's very squishy and sponge-like. It's also quite elastic. What we can see here anteriorly is we can see that the right lung has 3 lobes, an upper lobe, a middle lobe, and a lower lobe. And the upper lobe extends up into the neck. The left lung has just an upper lobe and a lower lobe. We have a lingula. This is a bit of a shape that forms here, which sometimes gets approximated to the middle lobe of the other lung. But we have an upper lobe and a lower lobe, and there's the apex up there. The apex is quite high, it's up in the neck there. But we can't see much of the lower lobe, because actually the lower lobe is very posterior. And the upper lobe is very anterior. The fissures between the lobes run all the way into the hilum of the lung. Right, so if I put that lung back together, you can see how it doesn't look like there's a lot of lung anteriorly, but if I turn this around, that's where most of the volume is, because there's a lot of space there in the posterior thoracic cavity there. So the lung is a lot larger than it looks from just the anterior aspect there. And as I turn the lung around, ignore this cut here, which is just a model thing. This line here is representing the oblique fissure, because it's running obliquely between the upper lobe and the lower lobe. So as I turn the lung round, you can see that the lower lobe is large and very posterior. So it's all about volume, it's all about surface area. In a real lung, I would be able to separate the lobes at the oblique fissure. I'd be able to pull those 2 lobes apart. They're quite separate structures. So the apex of the lung is up here, the pointy bit. The base of the lung is down here, sat upon the diaphragm. The lungs are very thin anteriorly, because they're filling the space between the heart and the thoracic wall, and they're very large posteriorly. All right, we've got an airway which can pass air in and out of the lungs. We've got the lungs, but how on earth do we pull air into the lungs and push air out of the lungs? Well, that's all about pleura. So the lung has got a shiny covering. This is a very thin covering, it's a transparent see-through covering, and that's called the pleura. And the inside of the thoracic wall is also lined with the same covering. And this is also pleura. And the diaphragm is covered by that same lining, the pleura. It is a continuous sheet. It runs in from the thoracic wall and the diaphragm, around the lung and back again. And we call it the parietal pleura when it lines the wall, because parietal refers to wall. We call it visceral pleura when it covers the lungs, because these are viscera, these are organs. And in life, inside an intact thorax, there is a potential space between those 2 layers, between the pleura lining the thoracic cage and the pleura covering the lung. And this is completely sealed. There's a little bit of fluid between those 2 layers of pleura, but nothing else. And because it's completely sealed, it's pretty much a vacuum in there, right? Which means that if you pull the diaphragm down, you pull the parietal pleura, which pulls the visceral pleura with it, which pulls the lung with it, because the lung is nicely elastic and it can change its shape. So most of the time, when the diaphragm is relaxed, it's in this dome shape. And then to breathe in, you flatten the diaphragm, this skeletal muscle that you have control over. And as you flatten the diaphragm, you increase the volume inside the thorax, and the lungs get pulled with the diaphragm, and air gets pulled into the lungs. Likewise, if you move the thoracic wall, if you move the rib cage, and if you take a very deep breath, and you put your hands on the front and back of your chest, your hands get pushed apart. And likewise, laterally. So you can move your ribs by elevating your ribs to increase the volume inside the thorax. And because the lungs get pulled with the body wall because of that negative pressure between the two layers of pleura, because of that vacuum, air gets pulled into the lungs and you breathe in and out. Demonstration? Plastic bottle. That's the rib cage. Glove inside plastic bottle. That's the trachea. The glove is the lung. Whereas this glove down here, this is the diaphragm. Oh, you can already see some movement there. Now, the space between the glove and the thoracic wall would be the pleural cavity. So in life, there wouldn't be a space there. They'd be right up against each other. This would be way more efficient. But this is a crude model that I made in the lab, where I have some gloves and bits I had lying around. So if I move the diaphragm, so if I pull the diaphragm down, you can see the lung inflating. And if I push the diaphragm up, you can see the lung deflating. That's because the volume inside the pleural cavity between the glove and the plastic is remaining the same, roughly. And I'm changing the volume inside the chest as a whole by moving the diaphragm up and down. So then to maintain the volumes in here, air gets drawn in. So the lung is covered with visceral pleura, the chest, the internal surfaces of the thorax are lined with parietal pleura, the diaphragm is covered with parietal pleura. As we change the volume inside the thorax by moving the diaphragm or by moving the rib cage, we can pull air into the lungs, push air out of the lungs. It's a thing. Does that kind of make sense? The other thing is that we talk about intercostal muscles. So intercostal muscles, intercostal means between the ribs. So we've got the ribs here, and we have a flat muscle. Well, 3 layers of muscle in most places between the ribs. These are the intercostal muscles. And we talk about how the intercostal muscles help lift the ribs and pull the ribs down. But actually, their main function here is the ribs and the muscles make a pressure barrel. And that tone in the muscles are running in opposite directions, is that they resist those pressure changes that you make in your chest by moving the diaphragm, by moving the ribs as a whole. So we're forming a wall. It's really important that we form a wall and we resist those pressure changes, so the pressure changes are then exerted onto the lungs and the lungs can fill with air and we can be nice and efficient about it. And in fact, we have lots of really, really big muscles that also attach to the rib cage because we've got these big upper limbs, right? So we've got muscles of the limbs that move the ribs as well. And we also have muscles in the neck that move the ribs. When you take in a deep breath, you can feel all of these muscles are contracting. So if you breathe normally, you're just moving your diaphragm. If you're breathing a little bit more vigorously, you're starting to pull your rib cage up and down. When you're taking a really deep breath, or you're working really hard, you start to recruit all these other muscles whose job is not to move the ribs, but to move the neck or to move the upper limbs. But if the neck is fixed in place, or the limbs are fixed in place, you can use them to take extra deep breaths. These are accessory muscles of respiration. Any muscle that attaches to the ribs can move the ribs if the other end is fixed in place. That's the idea. Whew, right, wow. All right, that was a visual introduction to the anatomy of the respiratory tract. There is a lot more detail to add. You've got the idea of an airway, the branching, the structures of the lungs, where they sit in the chest. their various sizes, relation to the heart, that sort of thing, and then we touched on the pleura. There is a lot more detail to all of this anatomy. If you're interested in more, search YouTube for my name and whatever you're interested in, and you'll probably find it because Google's pretty good at search. But I hope that was interesting. That's the main thing. See you next week.